An innocent black woman is sentenced to death for a crime she didn't commit. Her son watches in agony as she's led away in shackles, her fate sealed by a world that never gave her a chance. But when all hope seems lost, he does the unthinkable, storming into the governor's mansion with a shocking plea. Take me instead. As the execution clock ticks down, will his sacrifice be enough? Or will the truth come too late? This is a story of injustice, sacrifice, and one final act of courage that could change everything. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The crystal chandelier cast a warm glow across the Langley Estate's grand dining hall, its delicate crystals throwing dancing shadows on the dark wood-paneled walls. Evelyn Carter's shoes clicked softly against the polished hardwood floor as she carried the evening meal to the massive oak table, each step measured and precise as it had been for over 2 decades. The aroma of perfectly roasted beef and fresh herbs filled the air, mixing with the lingering scent of furniture polish and old money that seemed permanently embedded in the mansion's bones. Preston Langley sat at the head of the table, his silver hair neatly combed, his posture rigid as always. His pressed silk tie and tailored jacket spoke of wealth and privilege. He didn't look up from his newspaper when Evelyn placed his dinner before him, the china plate making only the softest sound against the crisp white tablecloth that she had carefully ironed that morning. "Your dinner, Mr. Langley," Evelyn said quietly, her voice gentle and dignified despite his cold shoulder. 22 years of service had taught her to expect nothing more than his usual grunt of acknowledgement, which came right on cue. Back in the kitchen, Evelyn hummed Amazing Grace under her breath, while she wiped down the gleaming granite counters. The familiar melody brought her peace, as it always did, reminding her of Sunday mornings in church with her children. The kitchen was her sanctuary, a place where she could feel God's presence even in this cold house filled with expensive emptiness. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, she sang softly, her rich voice barely above a whisper, the words carrying special meaning after all these years of service. A horrible choking sound cut through her hymn, echoing against the kitchen walls. Evelyn's heart jumped into her throat. She dropped her cleaning cloth and rushed toward the dining room, her sensible shoes squeaking against the floor. The sight that greeted her made her blood run cold and her knees weak. Preston Langley's face had turned an awful shade of gray, like wet cement. His body jerked violently, his manicured hands clawing at his throat as he fought for air. The newspaper lay crumpled on the floor, and his water glass had toppled, creating a growing dark stain on the white tablecloth like an inkblot of doom. "Mr. Langley!" Evelyn cried out, rushing to his side. Her hands trembled as she reached for his wrist, searching desperately for a pulse beneath his clammy skin. "Dear Lord, please help him." The sound of shattering glass pierced the air like a gunshot. Evelyn looked up to see Mr. Whitaker, the elderly butler, standing in the doorway, his face ghost white, surrounded by the broken remains of crystal glasses that had been on his serving tray. Tiny shards glittered in the chandelier light like scattered diamonds. "Murder!" he screamed, his aged voice cracking with accusation. "She's killed him." "No," Evelyn protested, her heart pounding against her ribs. "I would never—" A young maid appeared behind Mr. Whitaker, her starched uniform rustling as her hands flew to her mouth in horror as she took in the scene. "Oh my God!" she shrieked, turning and running down the hall, her footsteps echoing. "Someone call the police!" Evelyn's world began to spin like a carnival ride gone wrong. She could hear shouting throughout the house, footsteps pounding on the stairs, doors slamming in rapid succession. In the distance, sirens began to wail, growing louder with each passing second. "Please," she whispered, still holding Mr. Langley's limp wrist, feeling the last warmth fade from his skin. "Please, Lord, don't let this happen." The front doors crashed open with a bang that shook the chandelier. Sheriff Thomas Briggs charged in, his heavy boots leaving mud on the imported carpet. His deputies spread out behind him like a pack of hunting dogs, their hands hovering near their weapons. "Get away from him!" Briggs barked, his voice thick with authority and something darker. Before Evelyn could move, rough hands grabbed her arms, yanking them behind her back with unnecessary force. The cold bite of handcuffs shocked her wrists, metal clicking into place with terrible finality. "I didn't do anything wrong," Evelyn cried out, her voice steady despite her fear, drawing on decades of dignity. "I've served this family faithfully for 22 years. Sheriff Briggs's face twisted into an ugly smirk as he stepped closer, looming over her. His breath smelled of coffee and cigarettes as he leaned in, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "I knew you'd slip up someday, Evelyn." The deputies dragged her through the mansion's grand entrance hall, past the frightened faces of the house staff who pressed themselves against the walls like frightened mice. Outside, red and blue lights painted the manicured lawn in harsh alternating colors, exposing every detail of her shame to the gathering neighbors. Tears streamed down Evelyn's face as they pushed her toward the waiting police car, but she held her head high, silently praying for strength as she had done through every trial in her life. "Lord," she whispered as they forced her into the back seat, the vinyl cold against her legs, "I place my trust in you." The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the interrogation room's concrete walls. Evelyn Carter sat perfectly straight in the uncomfortable metal chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The bruises on her wrists from the handcuffs had darkened to a deep purple, but she barely noticed the pain anymore. Her church dress, worn proudly just yesterday evening, was now wrinkled and stained with tears she'd shed during the long night in holding. The fabric still carried the faint scent of laundry detergent and her favorite lavender perfume, a reminder of the normal life that had shattered so suddenly. Detective Robert Simmons studied her from across the table, his weathered face set in hard lines. The untouched coffee between them had gone cold hours ago, leaving a bitter smell hanging in the air. Dust motes danced in the harsh light, making the cramped room feel even more suffocating. "Let's not waste time," Simmons drawled, his voice thick with southern accent and smug certainty. He leaned forward, his chair creaking under his weight. His tie hung loose around his neck, and dark circles under his eyes suggested he'd been up all night too. Evelyn met his gaze steadily, drawing strength from the small cross pendant that hung around her neck. Her mama had given it to her years ago, telling her to keep her faith even in the darkest times. This was surely one of those times. Her fingers instinctively reached up to touch the familiar silver surface, worn smooth from years of worried touches. 22 years, Simmons continued, flipping through a thin file. The pages rustled like dry leaves in his thick fingers. "That's how long you worked for Mr. Langley. Must have built up quite a bit of resentment in all that time." "I served that family faithfully," Evelyn replied, her voice quiet but firm. The words carried the weight of countless early mornings and late nights. "I took care of their home like it was my own." Simmons's chair scraped against the floor as he stood up suddenly, beginning to pace. His heavy footsteps echoed off the bare walls. "Then explain to me why Preston Langley is dead, Miss Carter. Explain how a healthy man just happens to collapse right after eating food you prepared." "I didn't poison him." The words came out clear and strong, just as they had the dozen times she'd said them through the night. Each denial felt like a prayer rising up to heaven. A smirk played across Simmons' face as he slid the file across the table. Photos spilled out. Preston Langley's body slumped over the dining table, the half-eaten plate of food, Evelyn's own terrified face captured by an officer's body camera. The images seemed to mock her innocence. "You were alone with him," Simmons pressed, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. His shadow loomed over her like an accusation. "You served him his last meal. What was in it, Evelyn?" She closed her eyes briefly, remembering the routine she'd followed countless times before. The familiar motions played through her mind like a well-worn film. Roast beef, mashed potatoes, collard greens. The same meal I've prepared every Tuesday for years. "And you expect us to believe nothing was different this time?" Simmons leaned in close, his breath hot against her face. The smell of stale coffee and cigarettes made her stomach turn. "A white man's dead, Miss Carter, and you were the only one in the room." Evelyn's hands trembled slightly, but she kept them folded tightly in her lap. Her wedding ring caught the harsh light, a small comfort. "I am innocent before God and man." Simmons changed tactics, his voice suddenly gentle, almost fatherly. The switch was jarring, like honey covering poison. Look, I understand. Working for a man like that day after day, maybe he said something, did something. Maybe you just couldn't take it anymore. When Evelyn remained silent, his facade cracked. He slammed both hands on the table, making the coffee cup rattle and dance. Nobody's going to believe you. You understand that, right? Not in this town, not with your word against his. Still, Evelyn stared at the wall, her lips moving in silent prayer. Her mama's words echoed in her mind. Keep your dignity, child. No matter what they do to you, they can't take that away. The wisdom of generations steadied her racing heart. Simmons's face had turned red with frustration. He made one final circuit of the room before stopping directly in front of her, his hands planted on the table. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the room's chill. This is the last time I ask, Evelyn, did you kill Preston Langley? Evelyn met his gaze, her voice unwavering. The truth rang in every syllable. No. His eyes narrowed as a cruel smirk spread across his face. The expression aged him 10 years. Then I guess we'll see what the jury thinks. The door slammed shut behind him with a metallic clang, leaving Evelyn alone in the cold room. The echo seemed to go on forever, like the long night ahead. The courthouse buzzed with tension as morning sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden benches. James Carter's fingers trembled as they gripped his Bible, his knuckles white with strain. The leather-bound book, usually a source of comfort, felt heavy in his hands. Its pages, dog-eared from years of faithful study, seemed to offer little solace today. The gallery was packed shoulder to shoulder, filled with curious onlookers who had come to witness what the local paper called the trial of the century. James could hear their whispers, feel their stares boring into him. Some faces showed morbid curiosity, others barely concealed hatred. The air was thick with prejudice, making it hard to breathe in the stuffy courtroom. All rise, the bailiff's voice boomed through the courtroom, the Honorable Judge Henry Wallace presiding. Judge Wallace swept into the courtroom, his black robes billowing behind him like dark wings. His face was stern, lips pressed into a thin line as he took his seat at the bench. James had heard stories about Wallace's reputation, how he'd never let a black defendant walk free. The judge's cold eyes swept across the courtroom, lingering for a moment on James with unmistakable disdain. The heavy doors creaked open again, and James's heart clenched as two deputies led his mother in. Evelyn Carter walked with her head held high despite the chains that bound her wrists, the metal links clinking with each careful step. The prison dress hung loose on her frame. She'd lost weight during her weeks in jail, but her eyes still held that same unwavering faith that James remembered from his childhood, the same quiet strength that had guided him through his darkest moments. The whispers turned to harsh murmurs. "Murderer," someone hissed from the back. Others joined in with their own cruel comments. James closed his eyes, fighting back tears, his shoulders hunched against the wave of hostility. Prosecutor Alan Whitmore rose from his seat, straightening his expensive tie with manicured fingers. His young face carried an eager expression that made James's stomach turn. This was just another stepping stone in Whitmore's career, another conviction to add to his record. His polished shoes squeaked against the floor as he positioned himself before the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Whitmore began, his voice smooth as honey but laced with venom. "The case before you today is simple. Evelyn Carter, a woman who spent 22 years as a servant in the Langley household, finally snapped." James watched the all-white jury lean forward, hanging on every word. Their faces showed they'd already made up their minds. Some nodded along, while others scribbled notes with determined expressions. "The evidence will show that on the evening of May 15th, this bitter, resentful servant decided to take revenge." Whitmore's voice grew harder, each word falling like a hammer blow. "She poisoned Preston Langley's dinner, a man who had given her employment for over 2 decades, a man who trusted her in his home." The court-appointed defense attorney shifted uncomfortably in his chair, absently shuffling papers he hadn't bothered to read. He hadn't even bothered to meet with Evelyn more than once, hadn't looked for evidence that might prove her innocence. James could see the defeat in the man's posture. in the way he avoided meeting Evelyn's steady gaze. Whitmore continued his opening statement, weaving a tale of jealousy and revenge. He gestured dramatically, his voice rising and falling with practiced precision, like a conductor leading a symphony of lies. While Mr. Langley lay dying, gasping for breath, Evelyn Carter stood there watching the life drain from her employer's face. James gripped his Bible tighter, the leather creaking under his fingers. His mother sat perfectly still, her face a mask of dignity. But James could see the slight tremor in her clasped hands, the only sign of her distress. She kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to give her accusers the satisfaction of seeing her break. The prosecutor turned to face the jury, his expression grave. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is an open and shut case." His words echoed in the hushed courtroom, carrying the weight of inevitable conviction. James closed his eyes, his lips moving in silent prayer. He needed a miracle. They all did. But looking at the hatred in the courtroom, the eagerness of the prosecutor, and the stern face of Judge Wallace, James felt hope slipping through his fingers like grains of sand. The morning sunlight that had seemed so bright earlier now felt cold and distant, offering no warmth against the chill of injustice. The afternoon sun cast harsh shadows through the courthouse windows as the jury filed out for deliberation. James Carter's palm was sweaty as he gripped his sister Ruth's trembling hand. The old wooden benches creaked under their weight as they shifted nervously, watching the closed door where the 12 jurors had disappeared. The air felt thick with tension, heavy with the weight of what was to come. "They can't," Ruth whispered, her voice breaking. "They can't do this to Mama." Her shoulders shook with barely contained emotion. James tried to steady his breathing, but his chest felt tight. The courtroom remained eerily silent, filled with spectators who seemed to be holding their collective breath. He could see his mother's straight back from where she sat at the defense table, her dignity intact despite the weight of chains on her wrists. Her gray-streaked hair was neatly pinned back, the same way she'd worn it every Sunday for church. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second feeling like an eternity. James silently mouthed prayers, his free hand clutching the worn Bible in his lap, its pages soft and familiar beneath his fingers. Ruth's fingers dug deeper into his palm with every passing minute, leaving half-moon marks on his skin. 20 minutes. That's all it took. Not even enough time for a proper discussion, James thought bitterly. The bailiff's voice cut through the silence. "All rise." James and Ruth stood on shaky legs as the jury filed back in. Their faces were impossible to read, but something in their quick return made James's stomach turn. He watched the foreman hand a slip of paper to the bailiff, who then passed it to Judge Wallace. The paper trembled slightly in the bailiff's hand, the only sign of emotion in the formal proceeding. The judge's face remained impassive as he read the paper, then nodded to the foreman. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The middle-aged white man stood, clearing his throat. The sound echoed through the hushed courtroom like a gunshot. "We have, Your Honor." His voice carried a finality that sent chills down James's spine. James felt Ruth's hand squeeze his so tight it hurt. His heart hammered against his ribs as he stared at the foreman's face, silently begging God for mercy. The morning's breakfast churned in his stomach. In the matter of the state versus Evelyn Carter on the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant. The pause lasted only a second, but it felt like years. James could hear his own pulse pounding in his ears. Guilty. The word hit James like a physical blow. A choked cry escaped his throat as his knees buckled. Ruth collapsed against him, her body racked with sobs. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of gasps and murmurs, but to James it all sounded distant, as if he were underwater. Someone behind them whispered, "Lord, have mercy." Through his tears he looked at his mother. Evelyn Carter sat perfectly still, her eyes closed, her lips moving in silent prayer. Even now, facing the worst possible outcome, she maintained her dignity and faith. Her hands were folded peacefully in her lap, as if she were sitting in her favorite pew instead of a defendant's chair. The judge's gavel crashed down repeatedly. "Order! Order in the court!" The sharp crack of wood on wood punctuated each command. James stumbled forward, pushing past the barrier that separated the gallery from the court floor. He reached for his mother's hand just as two officers moved to take her away. His shoes squeaked against the polished floor. "Mama," he gasped, his fingers intertwining with hers. Evelyn's hand was warm and steady, so different from his own trembling grip. Her eyes met his, filled with a peace he couldn't understand. "Trust in the Lord with all your heart," she whispered, the familiar scripture falling from her lips. Her voice was gentle, as if she were comforting him instead of facing her own conviction. The officers grabbed her arms, pulling her away. James held on as long as he could, until their joined hands were forced apart. Ruth's sobs echoed through the courtroom as they watched the officers drag their mother toward the side door, her chains rattling with each step. The sound of metal on metal seemed to mock their helplessness. James stood frozen, his hand still outstretched as his mother disappeared from view. The verdict rang in his ears like a death knell, drowning out everything else. Guilty. 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 The words seemed to pulse with his heartbeat, a rhythm of despair that threatened to overwhelm him completely. The morning sunlight streamed through the tall courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors. The room buzzed with hushed whispers and shuffling feet as people packed the benches, their faces a mix of curiosity and judgment. Some leaned forward, eager to catch every detail of the proceedings, while others sat back with arms crossed, their verdict already decided in their minds. James Carter's knuckles were white as he gripped his Bible, his sister Ruth's hand trembling in his other palm. "All rise," the bailiff's voice boomed through the chamber, echoing off the high ceiling. "The Honorable Judge Henry Wallace presiding." The rustle of fabric filled the air as everyone stood. Judge Wallace swept in, his black robes flowing behind him as he took his place at the bench. His steel-gray eyes swept over the courtroom, cold and calculating, pausing briefly on Evelyn Carter, who stood tall despite the heavy chains that bound her wrists. Her simple blue dress, pressed carefully the night before, hung loosely on her frame after weeks in custody. "Mrs. Evelyn Carter." Judge Wallace's voice was cold and measured, each word falling like ice into the silent room. "You stand before this court having been found guilty of first-degree murder." James felt his heart hammering against his ribs, each beat a desperate prayer. Beside him, Ruth's breathing came in short, sharp gasps. The morning light caught the tears welling in her eyes, making them shimmer like broken glass. The judge adjusted his glasses, clearing his throat with deliberate slowness. "This court has carefully considered the evidence presented and the jury's verdict." He paused, his expression unchanging, his face carved from stone. "Mrs. Carter, this court sentences you to death by electric chair." The words hit like physical blows, reverberating through the stunned courtroom. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by murmurs of shock and approval. James lurched forward, his Bible clattering to the floor with a hollow thud. No, this is wrong." His voice cracked with desperation, raw with anguish. Ruth collapsed onto the wooden bench, her body racked with sobs that seemed to come from her very soul. "Mama," she wailed, the sound piercing through the commotion like a knife. Two officers moved quickly to restrain James as he tried to push his way toward his mother, their grip firm and unforgiving. "You can't do this," he shouted, struggling against their hold. "She's innocent, dear God, she's innocent." Through it all, Evelyn stood perfectly still, her eyes closed, her lips moving in silent prayer. When she opened them again, she turned to face her children, her expression serene despite the storm raging around her. Her gaze found James still wrestling with the officers and held steady. "Be strong, my son," she said, her voice steady and clear despite the chaos, carrying the weight of a mother's love and wisdom. The prosecutor, Alan Whitmore, sat at his table, a satisfied smirk playing at the corners of his mouth as he gathered his papers with unhurried precision. The jury remained stoic, their faces masks of indifference to the scene unfolding before them, some avoiding eye contact with the family they had just condemned. Judge Wallace's gavel crashed down once, twice, 3 times, each strike like thunder in the charged atmosphere. "Order in the court," he commanded. The room gradually fell silent except for Ruth's muffled sobs, which echoed in the stillness like a wounded animal's cry. "Court is dismissed," Wallace declared, his voice echoing through the chamber with finality. The bailiff stepped forward, taking Evelyn's arm with practiced efficiency. She held her head high as they led her toward the back doors, the chains on her ankles clinking against the floor with each measured step, a metallic rhythm marking her departure. Just before she disappeared through the doorway, she glanced back one final time at her children. James still restrained by the officers, his face contorted in anguish, Ruth crumpled on the bench like a discarded rag doll, and then she was gone, leaving behind a void that seemed to swallow all hope. The small church was silent except for the soft flickering of candles, their flames casting dancing shadows on the worn wooden pews. The musty scent of old hymnals and furniture polish hung in the air. James Carter sat alone in the front row, his broad shoulders hunched forward as if carrying an invisible weight. His fingers were balled into tight fists, knuckles white with tension, pressing hard against his thighs. The altar before him seemed to mock his pain, its polished surface reflecting the wavering candlelight like tears. The cross that had always brought him comfort now felt like a stranger, cold and distant, its shadow looming over him accusingly. His Bible lay untouched on the pew beside him, its leather cover reflecting the dim candlelight, the gold-leafed pages dulled in the darkness. James reached up with trembling fingers to clutch his cross necklace, the one his mother had given him when he first became a pastor. The metal felt ice-cold against his palm, each ridge and groove familiar, yet somehow foreign. "Where are you, God?" he whispered into the emptiness. The words hung heavy in the air, met only by deafening silence and the faint crackle of burning wicks. The quietness pressed in on him like a physical weight, suffocating him with each shallow breath. His chest tightened as anger began to bubble up from somewhere deep inside, hot and unstoppable. James shot to his feet, his breathing becoming ragged and uneven, his heart pounding against his ribs. His footsteps echoed through the empty church as he began to pace, each step more aggressive than the last, the floorboards creaking beneath his feet. The anger that had been simmering beneath the surface finally erupted like a volcano. "Why, God?" His voice boomed through the sanctuary, bouncing off the walls and stained glass windows. The sound of his own desperation frightened him, but he couldn't stop, couldn't contain the fury anymore. With a cry of anguish, he slammed his fist into the wooden pulpit. Pain shot through his hand as his knuckles split open, but he barely noticed the sharp sting. Dark drops of blood splattered onto the polished wood, marking his rage like crimson tears. His eyes fell on his Bible, the book he'd preached from countless times, its pages dog-eared and marked with years of study. In one fluid motion, he snatched it up and hurled it across the room with all his might. The binding cracked as it hit the wall, pages tearing loose and fluttering to the floor like wounded birds. Some pages caught in the candlelight, dancing momentarily before settling on the cold floor. The sight of the scattered pages that held verses he'd once found comfort in, made his throat tight with unshed tears. "You let her die," he choked out, his voice raw with emotion, barely recognizing the broken sound as his own. The tears finally spilled over, burning hot trails down his cheeks and dripping from his chin. "You let her be judged by these people who hate her." Each word felt like glass in his throat, cutting deeper with every syllable. His fingers found his clerical collar, the white strip that marked him as a man of God. For years, he'd worn it with pride, a symbol of his calling and dedication. Now it felt like it was choking him, tight and suffocating against his skin. With shaking hands, he ripped it away from his neck and threw it to the ground, watching it land among the scattered Bible pages like a surrender flag in the midst of battle. His legs gave out beneath him, and James crashed to his knees on the hard floor. The impact sent jolts of pain through his body, but he welcomed it. Sobs racked his body as he finally broke down completely, his cries echoing through the empty church like a prayer no one would answer, mixing with the shadows that danced on the walls around him. James's small apartment was a reflection of his inner turmoil. Empty coffee cups littered the kitchen counter, their brown rings staining the surface, and wrinkled clothes lay scattered across the floor like abandoned hopes. The curtains were drawn tight, leaving the room in a perpetual twilight that seemed to mirror his darkened spirit. The air felt stale and heavy, matching the weight in his chest, thick with the lingering scent of sleepless nights. He sat motionless on his worn armchair, staring at nothing, his fingers absently tracing the frayed fabric of the armrest. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually neat pastor's clothes were rumpled from days of wear, the collar of his shirt bearing coffee stains. His phone lay silent beside him, its screen dark and accusing. He'd stopped answering calls from his sister Ruth and his congregation days ago, letting their worried messages pile up unread. A sharp knock at the door made him flinch, the sudden sound like thunder in the tomb-like quiet. For a moment, he considered ignoring it, like he had every other visitor who'd tried to pull him from his isolation. The knock came again, more insistent this time, echoing through the empty rooms. With a heavy sigh, James pushed himself up, his joints protesting the movement. His muscles ached from sitting too long in the same position. He shuffled to the door, his feet dragging across the carpet, not bothering to check his appearance in the hallway mirror. A mirror now turned to face the wall, unable to bear his own reflection. When he opened the door, a prison guard stood there, straight-backed and official, his uniform crisp in the harsh hallway light. "James Carter?" the guard asked, holding out a plain white envelope that seemed to glow against his dark uniform. James nodded, his throat tight, constricting around unspoken words. "Letter for you. From the prison." The guard's voice was neutral, professional, betraying no hint of sympathy or judgment. James took the envelope with trembling fingers, the paper crackling softly in his grip. His mother's neat handwriting jumped out at him, making his chest constrict. The familiar curves and loops of her penmanship brought tears to his eyes before he'd even read a word. He closed the door without a word, leaning against it as he stared at the envelope, its edges sharp against his calloused fingers. The paper felt rough under his fingers as he tore it open, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. The letter inside was short, written in his mother's familiar, careful script, each word precise and deliberate. Each word seemed to burn into his mind as he read, like brands against his consciousness. "You are my son, but you are also God's child. I will not let my suffering become your burden. Keep walking, James." His breathing became ragged, catching in his throat like thorns. The words blurred as tears filled his eyes, hot and stinging. His jaw clenched so tight it hurt, teeth grinding against each other. The faith in her words, her acceptance, it was too much. It was wrong, all wrong. How could she still believe when the system had failed her so completely? "Faith won't save her," he yelled suddenly, his voice cracking like thin ice, the words tearing from his throat. His fingers dug into the paper, tearing it violently, each rip a physical manifestation of his pain. The pieces fluttered to the floor like dead leaves, scattered across the carpet just like the pages of his Bible in the church, torn in that moment of first despair. The rage drained from him as quickly as it had come, leaving him empty, hollowed out like a dead tree. His legs gave out, and he slid down the door until he hit the floor, the impact jarring his bones. His whole body shook as he sat there, surrounded by the torn pieces of his mother's last words to him, each fragment a testament to his broken faith. He was lost. Completely, utterly lost in a wilderness of doubt and despair. The faith that had guided him his entire life, the conviction that had led him to become a pastor, it all felt hollow now, like a church with no congregation. How could God let this happen? How could his mother still believe, still accept, still try to comfort him when she was the one facing death row's cold certainty? James pulled his knees to his chest, making himself small like he used to do as a child during thunderstorms, trying to disappear into himself. But there was no comfort to be found now, no mother's arms to hold him, no prayers to soothe his fears. There was only the silence of his apartment, the scattered pieces of the letter like fallen prayers around him, and the crushing weight of his despair pressing down on his shoulders like a crown of thorns. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the governor's mansion, its white marble steps gleaming like polished bone. James Carter's footsteps echoed through the courtyard as he charged forward, his heart pounding against his ribs like a desperate prisoner seeking escape. 2 security guards stepped into his path, their uniforms crisp and intimidating, but James barely noticed them through his tunnel vision of determination. "I need to see the governor!" His voice cracked with desperation as he pushed past their outstretched arms, feeling the fabric of their sleeves brush against him. More guards appeared from seemingly nowhere, their hands rough as they grabbed his shoulders with practiced efficiency. "I'll only take a minute. Just 1 minute of his time." James struggled against their iron grip, his suit jacket wrinkling in their hands like tissue paper. The pristine hallway stretched before him endlessly, its walls lined with portraits of past governors who seemed to stare down at him with cold, judgmental eyes that followed his every move. "Sir, you need to leave," one guard said firmly, trying to drag him back, his breath hot against James's ear. "Please." James's voice bounced off the high ceiling, echoing his desperation. "It's about my mother, Evelyn Carter. She's innocent." The sound of a heavy door opening made everyone freeze in place. Governor William Morgan stepped into the hallway, his face twisted with annoyance at the disruption. He was a tall man with steel-gray hair and eyes that had never known mercy, his expensive suit a symbol of his power and authority. "What is this about?" the governor asked, his voice carrying the weight of authority and barely concealed disdain. James fell to his knees, the marble floor cold and hard beneath him like winter ice. The guards loosened their grip but didn't let go, their fingers still digging into his shoulders. "Take me instead," he pleaded, looking up at the governor, tears threatening to spill from his eyes. The silence that followed felt endless, stretching like a rubber band about to snap. Then Governor Morgan's laughter filled the hall, sharp and cruel as broken glass. "You want to be executed? The law don't work that way, boy." His amusement was like a knife twisting in James's chest, each chuckle another wound. "Please." James's voice dropped to a whisper thick with emotion. "I beg you, she's innocent. If someone has to die, let it be me. I'm offering my life freely." The governor's smirk never wavered, carved into his face like granite. The courts decided. It's done. He straightened his silk tie with manicured fingers, already turning away as if bored by the whole scene. "Get him out of here." "Wait." James tried to stand, but the guards tightened their grip, their fingers pressing into pressure points. "She's my mother. She raised me alone, worked her whole life serving others. She deserves mercy, please." Governor Morgan didn't even look back, his indifference more painful than any words could have been. His footsteps faded down the hall like distant thunder as the guards began dragging James toward the exit. His shoes squeaked against the polished floor as he fought their grip, leaving scuff marks on the perfect surface. "You can't do this," James's voice echoed through the mansion, bouncing off marble and wood. "She's innocent. Please, you're making a terrible mistake." The guards pulled him roughly down the marble steps, his feet barely touching the ground, his tie fluttering like a broken wing. The afternoon sun felt like a spotlight, exposing his failure to everyone watching, burning into his skin like judgment. His last hope, crushed beneath the weight of indifference and prejudice, scattered like ashes in the wind. James was thrown onto the sidewalk, his palms scraping against the concrete, small pieces of gravel embedding in his skin. He could hear the guards returning to their posts, their boots clicking on the steps behind him like a metronome counting down his mother's remaining days. The governor's mansion loomed over him, as cold and unmovable as the system it represented, its windows reflecting the dying light like unseeing eyes. The morning sun crept over the horizon, painting the governor's mansion in shades of soft gold. James Carter's weary frame cast a long shadow across the pristine marble steps where he sat, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. Dark circles rimmed his eyes, evidence of another sleepless night spent wrestling with his thoughts and prayers. His wrinkled shirt clung to his back, damp with the morning dew. 2 security guards stood at their post, shifting uncomfortably as they watched him. The younger one, barely in his 20s, leaned toward his partner. "He ain't leaving, is he?" His hand fidgeted with his radio, uncertain whether to report the situation. The older guard shook his head, adjusting his belt. "Been here since dawn. Poor fool's gonna waste his whole day." He sighed, having seen his share of desperate people come and go. James placed his worn Bible beside him, its pages dog-eared from countless hours of desperate searching for answers. The leather cover was cracked and peeling, held together by faith more than binding. His knees met the cold stone as he lowered himself into a prayer position, hands clasped tightly enough to whiten his knuckles. As the morning stretched into afternoon, the sun beat down mercilessly. James's throat felt like sandpaper, and his empty stomach cramped painfully, but he remained unmoved. Sweat trickled down his temples, soaking into his collar. Pedestrians passed by, some stopping to stare, others hurrying past with averted eyes, their quick footsteps echoing against the mansion's facade. Through the mansion's grand windows, the governor's secretary peered out, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the glass. The crystal chandelier behind her cast dancing reflections across her worried face. "He's still out there, sir," she called over her shoulder, her voice tinged with unease. Governor William Morgan's voice carried from his office, thick with disdain. "Let him rot." The sound of shuffling papers punctuated his cold dismissal. The hours crawled by like molasses. James's legs had long since gone numb, but still he prayed. His lips moved silently, forming the same desperate words over and over. "Please, God, please, help my mother." Each word carried the weight of his breaking heart. As evening approached, the crowd began to grow. A handful of curious onlookers gathered across the street, their whispers carrying on the cooling air. Some held phones recording the scene, while others simply watched with a mix of pity and fascination. "That's the Carter boy," an elderly woman muttered, clutching her purse close. "His mama's the one they convicted." "Heard he's some kind of preacher," another added, shaking her head slowly. "Gone crazy with grief, poor thing." "The crazy preacher," someone scoffed, voice cutting through the murmurs. "What does he think this'll accomplish?" But James heard none of it. His world had narrowed to the pain in his knees, the rough texture of his clasped hands, and the endless stream of prayers flowing from his heart. The sky darkened overhead, and one by one, the mansion's windows lit up like golden eyes in the growing dusk. Moths began to gather around the streetlights, dancing in endless circles. The streetlights flickered to life, casting harsh shadows across the steps where James knelt. Their artificial glow highlighted the deep lines of determination etched into his face. In the distance, dark clouds gathered, promising a storm, their edges tinged purple against the fading light. Still, he remained, a solitary figure beneath the towering pillars of power, his faith the only thing holding him upright. The night air hung heavy with humidity as Ruth Carter pushed through the small crowd that had gathered outside the governor's mansion. Her heels clicked angrily against the concrete, matching the fury in her heart. Several onlookers stepped back, sensing the storm brewing in her eyes. The streetlights cast long shadows across the manicured lawn, making the scene feel even more surreal. "James, get your stupid self up," she snapped, her voice cracking with emotion. The words tasted bitter in her mouth, but she couldn't hold them back. Her brother knelt on the steps, his once crisp shirt now wrinkled and sweat-stained. His face was ghostly pale, dark circles shadowing his eyes. When he slowly opened them, they were glassy and unfocused, like those of a man lost in another world. His hands lay limp in his lap, trembling slightly. "Go home, Ruth," he whispered, his voice hoarse from hours of silence. The words seemed to cost him what little energy he had left. "Don't you dare tell me to go home." Ruth dropped to her knees beside him, grabbing his shoulders. The fabric of his shirt felt damp under her fingers, and she could feel him swaying slightly. Dying won't bring her back. James remained silent, his lips moving in what might have been prayer. Ruth felt tears burning in her eyes as she shook him harder, desperate to break through his self-imposed trance. The evening breeze carried the scent of nearby magnolias, a cruel reminder of their mother's favorite flowers. "You think Mama wants you starving yourself on these steps?" Her voice rose, drawing more attention from the crowd. Some people pulled out their phones, but Ruth didn't care who was watching anymore. "She's sitting in that cell right now, probably worried sick about you." "If I leave," James mumbled. I give up." His words were barely audible, but they made Ruth's blood boil. She could see the stubborn set of his jaw, the same expression he'd worn since childhood when he believed he was right. "Then let me make this real clear. Mama doesn't need a martyr. She needs justice." Ruth's fingers dug into his shoulders. She could feel the bones beneath his shirt, too prominent now after days without food. "Look at me, James. Look at me." Finally, James turned his head. Their eyes met, and for the first time since he'd started his protest, uncertainty flickered across his face. His unwavering resolve seemed to crack, just slightly, like a hairline fracture in glass. Ruth saw that crack and pressed harder. "You want to help? Then get up. Use that brain God gave you instead of throwing yourself away." Her words echoed off the mansion's stone facade, carrying the weight of days of fear and frustration. When James didn't respond, Ruth felt something snap inside her. Her hand moved before she could stop it, striking his cheek with a sharp crack that echoed in the evening air. Several people in the crowd gasped. The sound seemed to hang between them as heavy as the humid air. James barely reacted to the slap, but his eyes widened slightly. He touched his cheek, looking at his sister as if seeing her for the first time. A red mark bloomed where her hand had struck, stark against his pale skin. Ruth stood up, her whole body shaking. She stared down at her brother, this man she barely recognized anymore. Her palm stung from the slap, but the pain in her heart was far worse. The crowd's whispers grew louder, a backdrop to her ragged breathing. Without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed away, leaving James trembling in place on the cold steps. The crowd parted silently to let her pass, but she didn't see them through her tears. Behind her, the mansion's security lights cast long shadows across the lawn, stretching like bars across the ground. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the governor's mansion steps, where James Carter remained kneeling in silent prayer. His once crisp pastor's shirt was now wrinkled and stained with sweat, his face covered in 3 days' worth of stubble. Yet his eyes remained focused, his hands clasped tightly together, knuckles white with the intensity of his grip. The concrete beneath his knees had long since warmed through his dark slacks, but he barely noticed the discomfort anymore. From the shade of a nearby oak tree, Claire Harrison watched him intently. Her pencil moved quickly across the pages of her worn leather journal, capturing every detail, from the slight tremor in his shoulders to the way passing cars slowed to stare. The small crowd that had gathered earlier that morning had thinned in the heat, but James hadn't moved an inch, hadn't even paused to take a sip from the water bottle someone had left beside him. "What's the story here?" she muttered to herself, studying his unwavering posture. As an investigative journalist for the local paper, she'd covered countless protests, but this was different. There was something compelling about this solitary man, kneeling alone on the mansion steps, something that spoke of desperate faith rather than angry defiance. After another few minutes of observation, Claire straightened her blouse and approached him. The gravel crunched under her sensible shoes as she made her way up the path, each step measured and deliberate. When she reached James, she knelt beside him, close enough to see the exhaustion etched into his face and the dried tears that had left faint tracks through the dust on his cheeks. "You're making quite the statement," she said, her voice gentle but direct. Her words hung in the humid air between them, mixing with the buzz of cicadas in the trees. James didn't respond. His eyes remained closed, his lips moving in silent prayer, forming words she couldn't quite make out. Claire waited, used to the patient game of drawing out a story, her notebook balanced carefully on her knee. "You think the governor's gonna listen?" she pressed, tilting her head to study his profile. She could see his hands trembling slightly from exhaustion, but his posture never wavered, as if some invisible force was holding him upright. Finally, James turned to look at her. His eyes were bloodshot but clear, filled with a determination that made Claire pause in her note-taking. Deep creases had formed at the corners of his mouth, speaking of sleepless nights and endless worry. "I think God is," he said simply, his voice hoarse from lack of use, cracking slightly on the last word. Claire's pencil hovered over her notebook as she processed his words. She'd expected anger, perhaps desperation, but the quiet certainty in his voice caught her off guard. This wasn't just another protest story. There was something more here, something that made her reporter's instincts tingle with the promise of truth waiting to be uncovered. She glanced at the mansion's imposing white columns, then back at James's weathered face. Without a word, she opened her notebook to a fresh page and began writing, her expression unreadable as her pencil moved across the paper. The story forming in her mind was already different from what she'd expected to find. The guards at the gate shifted uncomfortably, watching as Claire continued to write, their hands fidgeting with their radios. A warm breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the distant sound of church bells from St. Mary's Cathedral. James closed his eyes again, returning to his prayers, while Claire's pencil scratched steadily against the paper of her journal, recording a story of faith that was only beginning to unfold. The early morning mist clung to the governor's mansion steps as Claire Harrison adjusted her camera settings. Through her viewfinder, she studied James Carter's thin frame. His once strong shoulders now slumped with exhaustion, but his hands remained firmly clasped in prayer. 7 days of kneeling had taken their toll. His clothes hung loose on his frame, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. The concrete beneath his knees had become like a second home, worn smooth from his constant vigil. A single raindrop splashed on the concrete beside him. Claire lowered her camera for a moment, watching as more drops began to fall, creating dark spots on James's wrinkled shirt. He didn't flinch or move to seek shelter. His lips continued moving in silent prayer, his faith seemingly stronger than any earthly discomfort. The gentle patter of rain created a rhythm that matched his whispered words. "Perfect," Claire whispered, raising her camera again. The rain created a misty halo around James's figure, and behind him, the white columns of the mansion rose like silent sentinels. She adjusted her angle slightly, making sure to capture both the lone man's desperate vigil and the imposing symbol of power that stood before him. The morning light cast long shadows that seemed to stretch toward him like reaching fingers. The camera's flash pierced the gray morning light. In that split second, James's face was illuminated, eyes closed, features drawn with exhaustion but somehow peaceful. The contrast was striking. One small figure kneeling in absolute faith against the towering facade of political authority. Droplets of rain caught the light like tiny crystals around him. Claire checked the image on her camera's screen and caught her breath. It was more than just a photo. It was a statement. The rain-soaked preacher, his Bible beside him, kneeling before the pristine white mansion, captured everything about this case. Hope versus power, faith versus injustice, one man's desperate stand against an unmovable system. Every detail told its own story, from his mud-stained pants to the way his hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles showed white. Back in her small apartment that evening, Claire sat at her desk, staring at the image on her computer screen. She had enhanced nothing. The raw photo told the story perfectly. Her fingers hovered over her keyboard as she composed emails to every major newspaper contact she had collected over her career. The soft glow of her desk lamp cast shadows across her determined face. "A son's desperate vigil to save his wrongly convicted mother," she typed in the subject line. She attached the photo and added a brief description of James's story, his mother's conviction, and his ongoing protest. Her hand trembled slightly as she clicked send again and again, watching the emails disappear into cyberspace. With each message sent, she felt a mixture of hope and anxiety flutter in her chest. By sunrise the next morning, Claire's phone was buzzing constantly with responses. The photo had struck a chord. Major newspapers across the country were picking it up, running it on their front pages. "A Preacher's Last Hope," the headlines read, the powerful image of James Carter's solitary vigil spreading across the nation. Social media was ablaze with shares and comments, each person touched by the raw emotion captured in that single frame. The rain had stopped, but James remained where he had been when she took the photo, still kneeling, still praying, unaware that his quiet protest was no longer quiet at all. The morning sun now bathed him in golden light, as if nature itself was highlighting his unwavering dedication. The press room of the governor's mansion buzzed with anticipation as cameras flashed and journalists shuffled in their seats. Governor William Morgan approached the podium with measured steps, his silver hair perfectly combed, his suit crisp and expensive. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and gazed out at the sea of faces with practiced indifference. "I've called this press conference to address the unnecessary hysteria surrounding a convicted murderer's case," he announced, his voice carrying through the speakers. The room fell into immediate silence, broken only by the scratch of pens against notepads. Claire Harrison sat in the third row, her notepad balanced on her knee. She studied the governor's face, noting the slight twitch in his jaw when he mentioned the case. Around her, reporters leaned forward in their seats, hungry for details. "The justice system has spoken," Morgan continued, his hands gripping the podium. "And I see no reason to question its judgment." Claire's hand shot up. The governor nodded at her reluctantly. "Governor, have you personally reviewed the evidence in Evelyn Carter's case?" Her voice was clear and steady, cutting through the stuffy air of the press room. Morgan's lips curled into a smirk. "That's what courts are for, Miss Harrison. And the courts found her guilty." He straightened his shoulders, looking down at her from his elevated position. A balding reporter in the front row raised his hand. "What about the preacher outside your mansion? The man refusing to leave?" The governor waved his hand dismissively as if shooing away an annoying fly. "He's just a desperate man looking for attention." His words drew murmurs from the assembled press. Claire leaned forward in her chair. "So you're not even considering his plea?" She kept her voice level, but her grip tightened on her pen. Morgan's face hardened, his eyes narrowing as he fixed Claire with a cold stare. "This state does not negotiate with criminals or their families." His words rang through the room like a hammer striking stone. The press room erupted with overlapping questions. Cameras flashed rapidly, capturing the governor's stern expression. Claire remained still in her seat, watching Morgan's face carefully as he fielded questions with increasing irritation. "The law is the law," he declared, raising his voice over the clamor. "And no amount of theatrical displays on my doorstep will change that fact." Claire stared at the governor, her expression neutral even as her mind raced. Morgan's dismissive attitude and harsh words hung in the air, and the room crackled with tension. She could feel it, the moment his arrogance had betrayed him. The dim lamp on Claire's desk cast long shadows across her cramped apartment. Papers covered every surface, police reports, witness statements, and court documents formed messy piles that threatened to topple over. The clock on the wall ticked steadily as Claire and James pored over the files for what felt like the 100th time. Claire's fingers drummed against a yellowed document, her other hand wrapped around a cold cup of coffee. Dark circles rimmed her eyes, but determination burned in them. "There has to be something we're missing," she muttered, more to herself than to James. Across the table, James slumped in his chair. His shoulders sagged with exhaustion, and his usual passionate energy had dimmed to a flicker. He pressed his fingers against his temples, trying to ward off a growing headache. "I don't know if I can take much more of this," he admitted quietly. Claire barely heard him. Her hand suddenly froze mid-tap, her eyes locked onto a single sheet of paper buried beneath others. She pulled it free, scanning the text intently. Her breath caught in her throat. "James," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Look at this." With trembling fingers, she slid the police report across the scattered papers. James leaned forward, squinting at the faded type. His voice was rough as he read aloud. Witness statement. White male, mid-30s, seen leaving the Langley estate minutes before Preston Langley collapsed. Their eyes met across the cluttered table. Hope sparked in James's tired face for the first time in days. "This means—" he stammered, hardly daring to believe it. Claire nodded vigorously, her exhaustion forgotten. "It means your mother wasn't alone with him when he died." She stood up, pacing the small space between her desk and the window. The prosecution's whole case was built on Evelyn being the only person with access to Preston before he died. This proves that's not true. James gripped the document so tightly his knuckles turned white. His voice shook with emotion as he spoke. This could change everything. He stared at the paper as if it might disappear, this fragile thread of hope they'd discovered. Claire gathered more papers, her movements quick and purposeful now. "We need to organize everything, build a clear timeline." She grabbed a fresh legal pad. "If we can identify this witness, track down the man they saw." James and Claire exchanged a look of renewed hope across the paper-strewn table. For the first time since his mother's conviction, James felt the weight on his chest lighten just a little. Maybe, just maybe, this was the miracle they'd been praying for. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the governor's office, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany desk. James's hands trembled as he held the police report, its edges worn from countless readings over the past sleepless nights. Claire sat beside him, her posture straight and professional, though her eyes betrayed her anxiety. The legal aide, Mr. Peterson, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses with an air of practiced indifference. His navy suit was perfectly pressed, matching the rigid formality of the office around them. James took a deep breath and slid the police report across the desk's smooth surface. This proves my mother wasn't alone with Mr. Langley when he died. His voice cracked slightly, but he pressed on. There was another person there, a white man seen leaving the estate. Peterson barely glanced at the document, his expression unchanged. And what do you expect the governor to do about it? His tone was flat, almost bored. Claire leaned forward in her chair, her reporter's notebook clutched tightly in her hands. A stay of execution, she said firmly. While we investigate further, this is new evidence that wasn't presented at trial. Peterson picked up the report with 2 fingers as if it might soil his hands. He skimmed it, his lips pursed. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner seemed deafening as James and Claire waited. Finally, Peterson reached for his desk phone. James held his breath as the aide dialed, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. Yes, sir, Peterson spoke into the receiver. Yes, I understand. I'll inform them. The minutes stretched like hours. James gripped the arms of his chair until his knuckles turned white. Claire's pen tapped nervously against her notebook. Peterson finally hung up the phone and folded his hands on the desk. His expression remained stern as he looked between them. You've got 30 days. The words hit James like a physical force. He collapsed back into his chair, relief washing over him in waves. Thank you, God, he prayed silently. But Peterson wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his voice sharp. But if you don't find anything new, anything substantial, she dies as scheduled. Do you understand? James nodded, his throat too tight to speak. 30 days. It wasn't much time, but it was something. It was hope. Claire gathered her things, her movements quick and purposeful. We understand perfectly, she said, standing. James rose on shaky legs, gathering the remaining documents. His mother would live to see another month. It wasn't victory, not yet, but for the first time since her arrest, he felt the weight on his shoulders lighten just a little. They walked through the ornate office, their footsteps echoing on the marble floor. James clutched the folder of evidence to his chest like a shield. As they reached the heavy wooden doors, he paused and looked back at Peterson. Thank you, he said quietly. Peterson didn't respond, already focused on other papers on his desk. James stepped out of the governor's office, blinking in the bright morning light. For the first time in months, hope flickered in his heart like a small but steady flame. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as James and Claire pulled up to the dusty parking lot of the Rusty Nail Bar. The building looked like it had seen better days, with peeling paint and a crooked neon sign that buzzed weakly even in broad daylight. James wiped sweat from his forehead, his hands trembling slightly. You sure this is the place? Claire nodded, checking her notes. According to my sources, Theo worked here for 3 years before the incident. They pushed through the heavy wooden door, and the cool, dim interior was a stark contrast to the bright Georgia heat. A few regulars hunched over their drinks, barely glancing up at the newcomers. Country music played softly from an old jukebox in the corner. The bartender, a weathered man with gray stubble and tired eyes, watched them approach. His hands never stopped wiping a glass with a dingy rag. Claire stepped forward, her voice professional but friendly. We're looking for a man named Theo. He used to work here. The bartender's expression didn't change, but his hands stilled for just a moment. Ain't seen him in a long time. Please, James said, leaning forward. It's important. My mother's life depends on it." The bartender's eyes narrowed. "Don't know nothing about that. Like I said, ain't seen him." James and Claire exchanged glances before heading back outside. The heat hit them like a wall, but they pressed on, walking down the town's main street. Most stores looked closed or abandoned, with only a few showing signs of life. They stopped at the local diner, the post office, and a small grocery store. Each time they were met with the same response: blank stares or quick denials. Finally, an elderly woman at the laundromat pointed them toward a small house on the edge of town. "That's where Theo's neighbor lives. Maybe she knows something." The neighbor, a middle-aged woman named Betty, stood on her porch nervously twisting her apron. Her eyes darted around as if checking to see if anyone was watching. "Theo Langley?" she asked, lowering her voice. He left town last week, just up and disappeared." James felt his heart sink. "What do you mean, disappeared?" Betty glanced over her shoulder before continuing. "One day he was here, the next gone. Left most of his stuff behind too. It wasn't like him at all." Claire pulled out her notebook. "Did he say anything before he left? Mention where he might be going?" "No," Betty shook her head. "But—" She hesitated. "There were some men. They came to see him a few days before. Fancy car, nice suits. They didn't look like they belonged here." James grabbed Claire's arm, his fingers digging in. "Someone got to him." Claire squeezed his hand reassuringly. "We need to find him before it's too late." They thanked Betty and walked back to their car in silence. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the empty street. James leaned against the hot metal of the car, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He clenched his fists, the frustration evident in every line of his body. "We're running out of time." The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as James walked down the long prison corridor. His footsteps echoed against the concrete floor, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air was thick with despair and the metallic smell of steel doors. The warden, a tall man with graying hair and cold eyes, moved deliberately as he led James through the maze of cell blocks. His keys jingled with each step, a sound that seemed to mock the gravity of the moment. "5 minutes," the warden said flatly, stopping at the last cell. "That's all I can give you." James nodded, his throat too tight to speak. The heavy door creaked open, revealing a small space barely bigger than a closet. There sat his mother, Evelyn Carter, on a thin prison cot. Despite the harsh surroundings, she looked peaceful, her hands folded in her lap as she prayed. When she looked up, her eyes held the same warmth they always had. The orange prison jumpsuit couldn't dim the dignity in her posture or the quiet strength in her face. "Mama," James whispered, his legs giving way as he dropped to his knees beside her cot. Tears spilled down his cheeks, hot and bitter. "I failed you. I couldn't save you." Evelyn reached out, her weathered hand covering his trembling one. Her touch was gentle, steady, just as it had been when he was a little boy scared of thunderstorms. "No, my son," she said softly, her voice carrying the melody of old hymns and Sunday mornings. "You have not failed." James couldn't look at her, shame and grief crushing his chest. But Evelyn lifted his chin with her finger, making him meet her gaze. "You've shown the world the truth," she whispered, "even when it seemed impossible. When others turned away, you stood firm. That's not failure, James. That's faith in action." His shoulders shook with silent sobs. "I don't know how to keep going, Mama. How do I live with this?" Evelyn closed her eyes, her lips moving in silent prayer. When she opened them again, they shone with tears but also with an unshakable certainty. "Keep walking, James," she said. "Trust God, for He will lead us both home." She squeezed his hand. "Remember what I taught you. Faith isn't just for the good times. It's for moments like these, when the path seems darkest." James watched as his mother bowed her head in prayer, her presence filling the tiny cell with a peace that defied understanding. Though his heart felt like it was being torn apart, something else stirred within him, a quiet resolve, born from his mother's unwavering faith. The warden's keys rattled outside the door, signaling their time was almost up. Evelyn continued praying, her whispered words a shield against the cold reality of their situation. James remained on his knees beside her, holding on to these final precious moments with the woman who had taught him everything about love, faith, and dignity. James burst through the heavy wooden door of the warden's office, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his hands trembled as he gripped the doorframe. Behind him, Claire Harrison rushed in, clutching a worn leather folder to her chest. "We have new evidence." James's voice cracked with desperation. "You can't execute her today." The warden looked up from his desk, his weathered face revealing nothing. Morning sunlight filtered through the barred windows, casting long shadows across the room's faded green carpet. Claire stepped forward, her heels clicking against the floor. She pulled out a yellowed page from her folder and laid it carefully on the warden's desk. "We found it," she said, her voice urgent but steady. Langley wasn't poisoned by Evelyn. His own business partner did it. The warden picked up the ledger page with careful hands, his eyes scanning the numbers and notes. His expression flickered, just slightly, as he read. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the tense silence. "Please," James said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let us take this to the governor. This is her last chance." He gripped the edge of the warden's desk, his knuckles white. The warden set down the page and rubbed his temples. Deep lines creased his forehead as he spoke. "I can't just let you walk in there. The system. Dot." "The system's broken," Claire cut in sharply. She planted both hands on his desk, leaning forward. "You know that. If you don't act, you're complicit." The room fell silent again. James held his breath, watching the warden's face. After what felt like hours, the older man reached for his phone. His fingers hovered over the keypad for a moment before he began dialing. The conversation was brief and tense. James could only hear one side, but his heart pounded with each word. The warden's voice remained measured, professional, as he explained the situation. Finally, he set the receiver down with a soft click. He looked up at James and Claire, his expression grave but determined. "You've got one shot," he said quietly. "You better make it count." James turned toward the window, watching as the morning sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. Through the bars, he could see the prison yard below, already bustling with activity. His mother was in there somewhere waiting, praying. The execution chamber's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the sterile room. The air felt thick with tension, making it hard to breathe. Evelyn sat in the electric chair, her hands resting calmly in her lap, despite the leather straps binding her wrists. Her gray prison uniform seemed to hang looser on her frame, but her eyes remained bright with an inner peace that defied her circumstances. James pressed his palms against the observation window, his reflection showing a man barely holding himself together. Dark circles ringed his eyes, and his clerical collar felt like it was choking him. The guard's heavy hand landed on his shoulder. "Son, you need to leave now. Don't make this harder than it has to be." James shrugged off the guard's hand, his voice cracking. "I won't abandon her. She's my mother." Inside the chamber, the chaplain's weathered hands trembled as he held his Bible. His voice quavered while reading from Psalm 23. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want." Evelyn's lips moved silently, following along with the familiar words. Her shoulders remained straight, dignity intact, even as the executioner checked the straps one final time. The metal headpiece gleamed under the harsh lights, waiting to deliver its deadly current. James watched helplessly through the glass, his breath fogging the window. "Mama, I'm here. I'm still here." His words came out in desperate whispers. "I should have done more. Should have found more evidence. Should have—" The chaplain's gentle voice carried through the chamber's speaker system. "Sister Evelyn, do you have any final words?" Evelyn opened her eyes, somehow finding James through the observation window despite its reflective surface. Her voice came through clear and steady. "Be at peace, my son. God's will be done." The warden stood to the side, his face an emotionless mask as he checked his watch. The minute hand ticked closer to the appointed time. He nodded to the executioner, who moved toward the control panel. James's knees weakened. He slumped against the window, one hand still pressed against the glass. "Please, God," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Not today. Please, not today." The chaplain's prayers grew louder, mixing with the hum of electricity and the sound of James's ragged breathing. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." Evelyn closed her eyes again, her expression serene despite the metal cap being lowered onto her head. The executioner's fingers hovered over the switch. The warden raised his hand, ready to give the final signal. James's heart hammered in his chest. Each second stretched into an eternity. His mother's words from their last visit echoed in his mind. "Keep walking, James. Trust God." But how could he walk forward from this? How could he trust when everything seemed so dark? The guard tugged at his arm again. "Last warning, Reverend, you need to leave." "No," James choked out. "I won't let her die alone. I won't." The chamber's phone suddenly rang, its sharp trill cutting through the tension. The warden's hand froze midair. Everyone in the room held their breath as he picked up the receiver. "This is Warden Mitchell," he answered, his voice clipped and professional. The room fell into complete silence as he listened to the voice on the other end. James watched, barely daring to breathe, his whispered prayer still hanging in the air. "Please, God, not today." The execution chamber's harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as James pressed his trembling hands against the cold glass. His mother sat perfectly still in the electric chair, her eyes closed in peaceful prayer, even as the guards made their final preparations. The clock on the wall ticked mercilessly toward 5 p.m. James's throat felt raw from hours of pleading. His legs could barely hold him up anymore. "Please," he whispered, though he knew no one could hear him through the thick glass. "Please, God." The door suddenly burst open with a thunderous bang. Theodore Langley stumbled into the room, his expensive suit wrinkled and soaked with sweat. His wild eyes darted around the chamber as he gasped for breath. "Stop!" Theodore's voice cracked with desperation. "My brother's business partner killed him." The room froze. The guard reaching for the switch jerked his hand back as if it had been burned. Even Evelyn's eyes flew open at the commotion. Judge Henry Wallace stood in the doorway, his face ashen. "Mr. Langley, this is highly irregular." "The paperwork!" Theodore pointed at the documents in James's hands, his finger shaking. "It's all there. I tried to keep it hidden. I was scared, but I can't anymore. I can't let an innocent woman die." Judge Wallace stepped forward, his authority crumbling. "This is not the time." "No!" Theodore whirled on the judge, spittle flying from his lips. "You don't understand. You can't let her die for something she didn't do. It was Richard Matthews, my brother's business partner. He poisoned Preston over the merger deal." The warden moved closer, his eyes wide with shock. "You're absolutely certain about this?" Theodore nodded frantically, tears streaming down his face. "Yes, it was Matthews, not her. She's innocent. I saw him do it. He slipped something into Preston's drink when she wasn't looking. I've been carrying this guilt for months." The guards exchanged uncertain glances. One of them reached for his radio, while another moved toward Evelyn, unsure whether to proceed with the straps. James's legs finally gave out. He slid to his knees, his forehead pressed against the cool glass as the room filled with a tense electric silence. Through the glass, he could see his mother's face, still peaceful but now with tears rolling down her cheeks. The clock continued its relentless ticking, each second echoing through the stunned silence of the execution chamber. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows in the prison hallway, as Judge Henry Wallace stood rigid, his usually commanding presence now diminished. His eyes darted between the confession papers and Theodore Langley, who was still catching his breath after bursting in with the truth. James Carter approached Wallace slowly, his footsteps echoing in the tense corridor. Despite his exhaustion, his voice carried a quiet strength. "You can't let this happen." Wallace's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his tie. "You know this confession doesn't mean she's free yet," he muttered. But the usual authority in his voice had cracked. The warden shifted uncomfortably beside them, checking his watch. We need the governor's decision before the execution can proceed." Through the window, they could see Evelyn still sitting in the chair, her expression serene despite the chaos unfolding around her. The sight seemed to pierce Wallace's carefully constructed facade. "This is a travesty," Wallace said, his voice barely above a whisper. He ran a hand through his gray hair, shoulders sagging under an invisible weight. "I've been a part of a flawed system." James stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the judge. "You can still do the right thing." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Wallace's composure cracked further, his face contorted with a mix of anger and shame as he slammed his hand against the wall. The sound made everyone jump. "It's too late for me to fix this," he growled, but the words carried more self-loathing than authority. Two guards approached uncertainly, hands hovering near their belts, unsure how to handle this unprecedented situation. Wallace turned away from them all, his shoulders hunched in defeat. The man who had sentenced countless people with unwavering certainty now stood broken by the weight of his own actions. The warden watched as Wallace's commanding presence crumbled. The judge who had ruled his courtroom with an iron fist now couldn't even meet anyone's eyes. He turned away, his face a mask of shame, as the guards moved in to reassess the situation. The governor's office felt impossibly still, as William Morgan leaned over his mahogany desk, his weathered hands spread across the scattered files. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the tall windows, highlighting the stress lines on his face. He let out a heavy sigh, his fingers drumming an anxious rhythm against the desk's edge. "I've never had a case like this," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. James Carter stood in the doorway, his heart pounding so hard he could barely breathe. The weight of his mother's life pressed down on this moment, making every second feel like an eternity. "Governor, please," James said, his voice steady despite his trembling hands. "You know she's innocent. You saw the confession." Claire Harrison stood quietly beside James, her reporter's notebook clutched tightly to her chest. Her eyes never left the governor's face, watching for any sign of what he might decide. Morgan picked up another document, scanning it before setting it down with a shake of his head. The room felt heavy with tension as he reached for his phone, then pulled his hand back. He stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the grounds where James had knelt in prayer for so many days. The political fallout from this... Morgan trailed off, turning back to face them. "But sometimes being governor means facing hard truths." He returned to his desk and picked up the phone. His hand was steady now, purpose replacing uncertainty. "I want the execution halted. Now." Claire released a long breath, her shoulders sagging with relief. James pressed his palms together, lifting them to his forehead as tears welled in his eyes. The governor's voice grew stronger as he continued speaking into the phone. "This is no longer a matter of politics. It's about justice." He listened for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, I understand the implications, but I've seen the evidence myself. Make the call." Another pause. "Immediately, that's an order." Morgan hung up the phone and looked directly at James, his face hard but resolute. "I've done the right thing. Your mother is safe. For now." The heavy iron gates of the prison creaked open, their rusty hinges protesting against the morning air. The sunrise painted the sky in gentle strokes of pink and gold, as if God himself was welcoming Evelyn Carter back to freedom. She stepped forward slowly, her simple dress swaying in the morning breeze, her face tilted up toward the warmth of the sun. James stood at the gates, his hands trembling at his sides. The sight of his mother walking free made his heart swell until he thought it might burst. "Mama!" he called out, his voice breaking with emotion. He ran forward, no longer able to contain himself. Ruth was right behind him, tears already streaming down her face. "I never thought this day would come," she sobbed, throwing herself into her mother's waiting arms. Evelyn wrapped her arms around both her children, holding them close. The familiar scent of her, like fresh cotton and sweet tea, washed over them, bringing back memories of home and safety. Her touch was gentle but firm, grounding them all in this precious moment. "I never doubted God would bring me home," Evelyn said softly, her voice steady and sure. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her smile was radiant. She reached up to touch James's face, her fingers gentle against his cheek. "You kept your faith, my son, even when it seemed impossible." James held his mother's hand tightly, looking out at the world that had been so cruel to them. The same sun that had risen every morning while his mother sat in a cell now blessed their reunion with its golden light. "We made it, Mama, we made it," he whispered, still hardly daring to believe it was real. Ruth wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, her shoulders shaking with emotion. "We're a family again," she said, her voice full of wonder and relief. She pressed closer to her mother's side, as if afraid Evelyn might disappear if she let go. Evelyn stood between her children, her head held high despite everything she'd endured. The prison walls loomed behind them, but she didn't look back. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the sun continued its steady climb into the morning sky. "The Lord kept his promise," she said, squeezing both their hands. "He brought us back together, just as I knew he would." Her voice carried the same quiet strength it always had, unchanged by the months of imprisonment and fear. The three of them began walking down the road together, their footsteps falling into an easy rhythm. The morning light grew stronger with each step, warming their faces and casting long shadows behind them. They moved forward as one, a family reunited, stepping into the promise of a new day. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows of the Carter family home, casting warm golden rays across the worn wooden floors. The house, once heavy with grief and uncertainty, now felt peaceful, like a sanctuary after a violent storm. Evelyn Carter knelt at the small family altar, her hands clasped tightly in prayer. The simple wooden cross hanging on the wall caught the morning light, creating a gentle glow around her bowed head. Her voice was soft but filled with deep gratitude as she whispered, "I don't know how to thank you, Lord." James stood by the window, his shoulders relaxed for the first time in months. The weight that had been crushing him was finally lifted, replaced by a quiet peace that showed in his eyes. He watched the neighborhood coming to life, children walking to school, birds fluttering between trees, everything seeming brighter somehow. Ruth moved quietly through the kitchen, humming an old hymn their mother had taught them years ago. The familiar melody floated through the house as she prepared breakfast, the smell of coffee and fresh biscuits filling the air. She carried a steaming cup to where her mother knelt, placing it gently beside her. "We've got time for a proper breakfast now," she said, her voice warm with love. Evelyn looked up at her daughter, her eyes glistening with tears of joy. The simple act of sharing breakfast together, something they'd been denied for so long, felt like an extraordinary blessing. "Thank you for believing," she said softly. "Even when I couldn't." James walked over to join them, his footsteps steady and sure. Gone was the desperate man who had knelt outside the governor's mansion. In his place stood someone stronger, tempered by faith and trial. "We're a family again," he said, his voice carrying the strength of conviction. "And no matter what happens, we'll face it together." The morning light caught the silver cross hanging around Evelyn's neck, the same one she'd worn through her darkest days in prison. She touched it gently, remembering how it had been her anchor when everything else seemed lost. Her prayer finished with a final, heartfelt amen. Ruth reached for her mother's hand, helping her to her feet. The three of them stood together in the quiet morning light, their bond stronger than ever before. Evelyn looked up, a peaceful smile gracing her face as she whispered, "Thank you, Lord." The family stood together, united not just by blood, but by a faith that had carried them through their darkest hour. James Carter's footsteps echoed through the quiet church as he walked toward the pulpit. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the worn wooden pews. The small congregation, barely 24 faithful members, rose as he took his place. His fingers traced the familiar edges of the pulpit where he had preached so many times before. The wood felt different now, somehow both foreign and deeply familiar. He closed his eyes and drew in a deep breath, feeling the weight of the silence around him. "For a long time I couldn't understand why God let my mother suffer," he began, his voice soft but steady. "I couldn't see past the pain. Several members nodded quietly, remembering his struggle. Mrs. Henderson, who had attended this church for 40 years, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. James gripped the pulpit tighter, his knuckles whitening slightly. But what I've learned, what I've seen through her faith, is that God works even through the darkest trials. He paused, looking around the room at the faces before him. Some were tear-stained, others wore expressions of deep understanding. These were the people who had prayed for his mother, who had supported them even when his own faith wavered. Sometimes our prayers aren't answered when we want them, he continued, his voice growing stronger. But they are answered, in ways we cannot see. And now I know, this wasn't just about my mother's freedom. This was about me learning what true faith means. Mr. Wilson, an elderly deacon, whispered a quiet, "Amen." A few rows back, Sarah Collins wept silently, nodding in agreement. The morning light shifted, casting James in a warm glow as he stood at the pulpit. His shoulders, once bent with despair, now stood straight and strong. The congregation leaned forward, drawn in by the powerful transformation they witnessed before them. James raised his hands toward the heavens, his voice filled with newfound strength. The congregation bowed their heads in silent prayer, united once again under their pastor's guidance. The kitchen was filled with the comforting aroma of simmering stew as James stirred the pot on the stove. Warm evening light filtered through the lace curtains, casting gentle shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Ruth sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea, watching her brother with uncertainty in her eyes. James caught her gaze in the reflection of the kitchen window and smiled gently. "We're okay now, Ruth. Everything is going to be all right." Ruth bit her lip, her fingers tightening around the mug. "I don't know if I can ever forgive myself for what I said to you." Her voice trembled with the weight of memories, the harsh words spoken in fear and anger outside the governor's mansion. James turned away from the stove, his face filled with understanding. "It wasn't easy for either of us, but we're in this together." He wiped his hands on a dish towel, the simple domestic gesture somehow making the moment more real. Ruth pushed back from the table and walked over to where James stood. Her voice cracked as she spoke. "I was so scared, James. I was scared we were going to lose Mama, and I took it out on you." Tears welled in her eyes, threatening to spill over. James wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. The gesture was familiar, reminiscent of countless times he'd comforted his little sister growing up. "I get it, Ruth. I was angry too. But we don't have to carry that weight anymore." Ruth leaned into his embrace, letting out a shaky sigh of relief. "I was afraid that losing Mama meant losing you too." The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken fears. James pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, just as he used to do when they were children. "We'll never lose each other. Not after everything we've been through." His voice was steady, filled with the quiet certainty that had returned to him. Ruth wrapped her arms around her brother's waist, her tears now flowing freely, a mixture of relief and love. They stood together in the warm kitchen, the smell of dinner cooking around them, their bond stronger than ever before. The sound of the stew bubbling on the stove filled the comfortable silence between them. Through the window, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, a peaceful ending to a day of healing and reconciliation. James and Ruth remained in their embrace, two siblings who had weathered the storm together and come out stronger on the other side. The kitchen, once a place of lonely meals and worried conversations, was now filled with the warmth of family and the promise of better days ahead. The newspaper office buzzed with the steady clicking of typewriters and murmured conversations. Morning light streamed through the dusty windows, illuminating particles floating in the air. Claire Harrison stood in the doorway of her editor's office, clutching a thick manila folder to her chest. "I've got something big," she said, her voice steady but urgent. "It's about Judge Wallace." The editor looked up from his desk, his reading glasses perched on the edge of his nose. "What do you mean?" Claire stepped forward and placed the folder carefully on his desk. "There are financial discrepancies in his court rulings. He's been bribed by powerful businessmen in the town." The editor's eyebrows shot up as he reached for the folder. He opened it slowly, methodically reviewing each document inside. His eyes widened as he turned page after page. "This is huge, Claire," he said, running a hand through his graying hair. "You've got proof of corruption." He held up a document, studying the numbers closely. Bank statements, mysterious deposits, cases that align perfectly with these payments. Claire nodded, her expression serious. It's time for him to be held accountable. His role in Evelyn's case isn't just a mistake, it's part of a larger pattern. She pointed to specific documents. "See these dates?" Every time a major business case came through his court, there was a corresponding deposit in his offshore account. The editor immediately reached for his phone, his fingers already dialing. "This story's going out today. The public needs to know." He paused, looking up at Claire. "Are you absolutely certain about these sources?" "Triple-checked everything," Claire confirmed. "Bank records don't lie, and I've got 3 separate witnesses willing to go on record." The editor nodded, continuing to dial. His secretary appeared in the doorway, and he waved her in urgently. "Get the layout team in here now. Front page needs to be completely redone." Claire watched as the office suddenly burst into activity. Journalists gathered around the editor's desk, examining the evidence she'd gathered. The layout team rushed in with drafts and templates. The editor barked orders, organizing the chaos into purposeful action. "I want this story airtight. No room for Wallace to wiggle out of this one." Claire smiled slightly as she watched the editor make the call that would set everything in motion. The truth was finally coming to light. Governor William Morgan's office felt different today. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. The morning papers lay scattered across his mahogany desk, their bold headlines screaming about Judge Wallace's corruption. James Carter stood tall, his shoulders straight, a far cry from the broken man who had once knelt outside these very walls. Beside him, Claire Harrison held her camera steady, ready to capture whatever came next. Morgan picked up one of the newspapers, his weathered hands trembling slightly. $50,000, he read aloud, his voice heavy. That's what Wallace took to rush through verdicts, to ignore evidence. He dropped the paper and looked up at James. "Your mother's case wasn't the only one." "No, sir," James replied softly. "But it's the one we can fix right now." The governor's chair creaked as he leaned back, running a hand over his face. "I've been in politics for 30 years, he said. "You know what that means? It means I've learned to look the other way when it was convenient, to trust the system even when I knew something wasn't right." Claire stepped forward, her camera hanging at her side. "Governor, the system failed, but you can change that." Morgan nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the papers before him. "I've been avoiding this for too long," he muttered, more to himself than to his visitors. The weight of responsibility seemed to press down on his shoulders. James moved closer to the desk, his voice steady and clear. "Governor, the truth has already come out. It's time to right the wrongs." The office fell silent. Even the usual bustle from the hallway seemed muted, as if the whole building was holding its breath. Morgan reached for his phone, his hand hovering over it for a moment. "I've let politics cloud my judgment for far too long," he admitted, picking up the receiver. His fingers dialed the number with practiced precision. The room grew tenser with each digit. "This is Governor Morgan," he spoke into the phone, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority. "I'm calling about Evelyn Carter." He paused, listening to the voice on the other end. "Yes, that's correct. I've reviewed all the evidence, including the recent revelations about Judge Wallace's misconduct." James held his breath, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. Claire lifted her camera, focusing the lens on Morgan's face. "Evelyn Carter's conviction is overturned," Morgan declared firmly. "Release her immediately." The words hung in the air like a prayer answered. James and Claire exchanged stunned glances. Relief washed over James's face, and tears welled in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Morgan spoke a few more words into the phone, confirming details and ensuring his orders would be carried out without delay. When he finally set the receiver down, The click seemed to echo through the office. He looked up at James and Claire, his expression heavy with the responsibility of his position. "I've made the right choice," he said simply, and for the first time that morning, his voice carried no trace of doubt. Sunlight filtered through the Venetian blinds in James's office, casting striped shadows across the manuscript on his desk. The room smelled of old books and fresh coffee, a comfortable space filled with 2 decades of memories captured in photos and newspaper clippings on the walls. James ran his fingers over the title page, "The Gift of Mercy, A Son's Fight for Justice." The paper felt smooth beneath his touch, but the words carried the weight of a lifetime. Across from him, Claire Harrison adjusted her recorder, her notepad already filled with her precise handwriting. "It's hard to believe it's been 20 years, Claire mused, her eyes taking in the man before her. James had aged well, the silver at his temples giving him a distinguished look, and his eyes held a peaceful strength that came from walking through fire and emerging stronger. James smiled softly, remembering. "Some stories never leave you," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "But this one saved me." He flipped through the pages, each one containing memories both painful and precious. Claire watched him thoughtfully, her pen poised above her notepad. The sunlight caught the silver in her hair too. They'd both grown older, wiser, changed by the journey they'd shared. "Tell me about writing it," she prompted. "What was it like, putting it all down on paper?" James leaned back in his chair, his fingers still resting on the manuscript. It was like reliving everything. The courtroom, the fear, the moments of despair, but also the miracle of it all. The day Mama walked free when we finally got to bring her home. His voice trailed off, thick with emotion. "You gave up everything for her," Claire remarked, her voice soft with admiration. James shook his head, a gentle smile playing on his lips. "I didn't give up," he replied, his voice steady. "I found something I didn't even know I needed. Hope." He gestured to the walls around them, covered with framed newspaper articles and photos. "Hope isn't just about believing things will get better. It's about finding the strength to make them better." Claire turned the page of the manuscript, her eyes scanning the words she'd read so many times before. "Your story touched so many lives. And now, it's a part of history." She paused, looking up at him. "How does that feel?" James stood and walked to the window, his reflection overlaying the view of the busy street below. "It feels like exactly what it was meant to be," he said quietly. "A testimony to faith, to justice, to never giving up on what's right." He turned back to face Claire, a soft smile playing on his lips, content with how far he'd come and the family he'd helped rebuild. Sunlight streamed through the lace curtains of Evelyn's bedroom, casting a gentle warmth across her peaceful face. The room smelled of fresh flowers and lavender, just as she had always kept it. James sat beside her bed, his large hand wrapped tenderly around her smaller one, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest. "You were always my strength, Mama," he whispered, his voice catching slightly. "I'm here. I won't let you go alone." Ruth appeared in the doorway, clutching a worn photo album to her chest. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but she managed a small smile as she entered the room. The wooden floorboards creaked softly under her feet as she approached the bed. Evelyn's eyes fluttered open at the sound and her face lit up with recognition. Despite her weakness, her smile remained as warm and loving as ever. James squeezed her hand gently, feeling the paper-thin skin beneath his fingers. "I have lived a full life," Evelyn whispered, her voice barely audible but filled with contentment. "And I have no regrets." James tried to smile through his tears, but they fell anyway, landing softly on the bedsheet. Ruth settled on the other side of the bed, opening the photo album across her lap. The pages were filled with memories, snapshots of their family through the years before and after their ordeal. "I will never forget what you did for us, Mama," Ruth said, her voice trembling with emotion. She reached out and touched her mother's arm, her fingers gentle against Evelyn's skin. The afternoon light painted everything in soft gold, making the moment feel almost surreal. Evelyn's breathing grew slower, more peaceful. Her eyes, still filled with infinite love for her children, began to close gently. James and Ruth moved closer, each holding one of their mother's hands. The room fell into a soft silence, broken only by the distant sound of birds singing outside the window. It was as if nature itself was offering a gentle lullaby for Evelyn's final moments. Evelyn's chest rose and fell one last time as she drifted away peacefully, her children by her side. The room filled with a profound silence that seemed to honor every moment of her remarkable life and the legacy she left behind. Sunlight streams through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the church pews. James Carter stands at the pulpit, his hands resting gently on its worn wood. The church is packed, every seat filled with those whose lives Evelyn touched. My mother was not just a survivor, she was a testament to the power of faith, family, and love. James's voice carries clearly through the microphone, steady despite the weight in his heart. Ruth dabs at her eyes with a white handkerchief, her shoulders trembling slightly. In the front row, familiar faces from their long journey sit together. Claire Harrison, her notepad tucked away for once, and even Theodore Langley, his head bowed in respect. The back pews hold faces James doesn't recognize. People who'd read about Evelyn's story, who'd been moved by her unwavering faith. When I think about Mama, James continues, his voice growing stronger, I remember how she'd sing hymns while cooking Sunday dinner, how she'd pray every morning, no matter how tired she was. Even in prison, she never lost her light. Ruth nods slowly, remembering those dark days. A soft murmur of agreement ripples through the congregation. She taught us how to live with integrity, how to fight for justice, and most importantly, how to forgive. James pauses, letting the words sink in. She showed us the strength in standing up for what's right, even when the world tells you to stay silent. The morning light shifts, casting a warm glow across the altar. James looks down at his notes but doesn't need them. These words come straight from his heart. Mama never wanted revenge. She wanted understanding. She wanted change. His voice catches slightly. And through her faith, through her courage, she achieved both. Ruth straightens in her seat, pride mixing with her grief. She watches her brother, remembering how far they've both come. This isn't goodbye, Mama, James whispers into the microphone, his eyes glistening. It's only the beginning of your legacy. The congregation sits in respectful silence, many wiping away tears. Some nod in agreement, others bow their heads in prayer. 6 pallbearers step forward as James finishes speaking. The church doors open wide, letting in a flood of bright sunlight. They lift Evelyn's casket with careful reverence and begin their slow procession down the aisle. James and Ruth fall in step behind the casket, their shoulders straight despite their grief. The congregation rises, joining the procession that will carry Evelyn Carter to her final rest. The soft glow of the lamp casts long shadows across James's living room. He sits in his worn leather armchair, his fingers tracing the edges of an old photograph. In it, Evelyn stands tall and proud, her smile radiating the same quiet strength she carried throughout her life. You always knew, Mama, he whispers, his voice thick with emotion. You knew the way. The words hang in the air, heavy with decades of memories. Ruth sits beside him on the couch, her silver-streaked hair catching the lamplight. She looks over at her brother, a gentle smile crossing her face. We got there together, James. James nods slowly, carefully placing the photo back on the side table. I finally understand, he says, his eyes distant with reflection. The clock on the wall ticks softly as James leans back in his chair. It's funny, he says quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. I spent so much time fighting for her, but it was really about learning to fight for myself. Ruth reaches out and takes his hand, her grip warm and reassuring. Her fingers intertwine with his, just as they did all those years ago when they stood together in the courthouse. We made it, James. We made it through the storm. James squeezes her hand back, remembering the countless nights of prayer, the endless days of waiting, the moments of despair that threatened to overwhelm them. But through it all, Evelyn's faith had guided them, her unwavering spirit showing them the way. She taught us more than just survival, James continues, his eyes fixed on the dancing shadows on the wall. She showed us how to live with dignity, how to hold on to hope when everything seemed lost. Ruth nods, understanding filling her eyes. And look at us now, she says softly. Still here, still together, just like she always wanted. The room falls into a comfortable silence, filled with the weight of shared memories and the quiet strength of their bond. The photograph of Evelyn watches over them, her smile as bright and true as the day it was taken. Outside, crickets chirp their evening song, and a gentle breeze rustles through the trees. Inside, two siblings sit together, their hearts full with the legacy their mother left behind, a legacy of faith, courage, and unconditional love. If you enjoyed the story of Evelyn, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it. Courage and unconditional love. If you enjoyed the story of Evelyn, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.